Hey everyone. You should all be able to hear me. Hopefully you can all see me or see my screen at least. Thanks for joining me. Whoever joins this conversation, please let me know in the chat if you're able to hear what I'm saying. If somebody could just type in the chat, I just want to make sure that people are hearing what I'm saying. And by the way, I will keep the link in the chat. I'll post a link so that people can if themselves can join the chat. So I've copied the link and I'll put it here in the chat. There we go. So now the link to join the conversation should be appearing there in the chat. And I will also put it on the video itself so that people can join if they'd like to. The main thing that I'm going to be talking about today is the CTF argument. So this has been my most popular video to date. So I thought I could hone the argument, sharpen it a little bit, address some questions, address some of the things that people are asking frequently, and also this could be a opportunity for you all to ask your questions in real time. So if you have questions about the CTF argument, this is kind of the conversation for you to ask those questions if you'd like. Now, you can also ask me whatever other questions you have about Christianity or about other topics that I've talked about on the channel, and I'm happy to really open it up to talk about anything that is on your minds. But what I'm going to focus on is the comparative theological framework argument. Now, I'm going to provide some context behind the argument, the intentions, and the limitations that I didn't go into in the actual video. So, oh, great. Oh, okay. Thank you, Max Michael, 1840. I know you had some great questions. I hope you'll join and consider asking some of those questions in real time if you'd like, or you can put them in the chat. But I appreciate you weighing in that you can hear me. That's great. Thanks. That's encouraging. All right, so I'm going to go through the slides and I'm going to address some commonly voiced questions, but I also want to be a little more explicit about some of the limitations of the analysis and basically what I had in mind when I created this argument. So my goal was, good question. This is Dr. Kurt with a question. Am I going to be going over all 13 points? My goal is to get to the empirical points and at least get to the first qualitative point. And my understanding, Dr. Kurt, which is also the name for @Allen0465, is that you did. I did ask you for this. I think in a couple of different chats. But if you would like, feel free to add your Substack link because I'd be kind of curious to see what you'd written. And I'm remiss for not seeing what you said about the CTF argument. So I'm happy to give people a little bit of airtime to ask questions that they have about the argument. We're probably not going to go through all 13 points just in the interest of time. I'd like to get through all the empirical points at the very least and touch on at least the first qualitative argument because I think it's an important one. Okay, that's the first post is what Dr. Kurt is saying. Okay, hopefully I'll be able to see it. All right, so I wanted to address the CTF argument because I think some of these points were maybe glossed over in my presentation, but it is a ranking argument. So I know some of you had really valid, quite persuasive points that you voiced about the fact that the CTF doesn't necessarily dissuade someone from choosing atheism as their vantage point. I'm starting from the perspective of a rational theistic gambler, in other words. And that's an explicit limitation of the analysis. So the reason why oh, interesting. Okay, so YouTube is hiding the link. It looks like you put it in the chat, and I apologize that it's hidden. And Max has joined the chat, so I'm going to add you to the stage, Max. And if you want to talk, Max, let me see if I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. That's great. Can I ask? Can I just ask how old you are? You don't have to tell me how old you are, as long as you're
I'm
over
33.
18. Okay, perfect. Just as long as you're over 18. So, all right. So, and Max, if you want, you can ask me questions as I go through the argument. But it is sort of a ranking argument. So, given theism, so starting with theism as a starting point, which tradition has the highest degree of epistemic confidence? By the way, what I really want to express appreciation for, which was voiced by Max and some other individuals, is that a lot of you voiced that this was, at the very least, a novel set of arguments. I think that's about as much praise as I can get from some perspectives, and I think it's I take that as real legitimate praise. If I'm putting out a new argument that hasn't been previously addressed, then I think that's a good starting point. Um, yeah, it's so I just want to acknowledge again, Dr. Kurt wrote an article about CTF that I haven't read. I'm remiss for not reading it, but I can't see the link. It sounds like he's saying that YouTube is hiding the link. He put it in the chat twice. I don't know if there's any way that I can turn that off. If you want, you could spell out the link, like instead of hashtags, you can say, and marks, and um, if that's something you want to put in. And then I'll just show this most recent comment also from Dr. Kurt. It is great that the theist is making the argument from evidence. That's true. I mean, the fact that you're characterizing it as an argument from evidence is I think, at least to some degree, a compliment, I hope. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about the rational theistic gambler paradigm. My goal with this paradigm is to say, like, if it's a ranking argument, if you had a theistic vantage point from the start, what religion would you choose based on the evidence? What religion is most justifiably, epistemically on high ground or has high confidence? Now, the criteria explicitly emphasize that this rational theistic gambler doesn't have any context about, personal commitment, community preference, family preference. So this is designed to be an objective and not a subjective preference. Many of you had really great insights on this topic in and of itself. I just want to acknowledge that I don't actually believe that subjectivity should be entirely excluded from a discussion on theology. Ludwig von Wittgenstein had a lot of great insights on this. He talked about how really theology, morality, and beauty are all domains that are outside of the sciences. I don't necessarily think that that's untrue. I just want to give you some examples where a subjective preference might be a more valid starting point from some individuals. So again, the goal is to be objective, but a subjective stance would be valid as well. If you're just joining the chat, by the way, and Max, also feel free to stop me. Feel free to ask any questions. You're muted right now, but I think you've muted yourself. So feel free to unmute yourself and just ask questions. And you can also ask questions in the chat. But let me give you just some instances where subjectivity would actually be an appropriate decision criteria for deciding which religion to follow. So one of those situations would be, let's say that you just have a strong personal preference for or against a specific religion. The rational theistic gambler is sort of behind a John Rawlsian style veil of ignorance, so ignorant of their own subjective preferences. But I could easily see somebody saying, look, I've got a subjective preference. Maybe your subjective preference is just that you really like pork, and any religion that prohibits pork is a non-starter. Now, I'm not meaning to be glib or flippant with that. I really mean that's a real consideration that I wrestled with. Here's another example of a subjective preference. Let's say that you're in a family, you're in a community that really values a specific set of religious practices that is maybe more transcendent to you than a specific scientific or objective style set of arguments. I think that's a very legitimate preference. So if those are all examples of subjectivity that would be valid. Another example of subjective preference would be, let's say that you've had a personal theological experience that you find to be quite moving. So if that's the case, and you find that if your deity has specifically spoken to you, like I know people who are Muslim certainly who will say, I know that this is true because I feel like the voice of God telling me that this is theological truth. I actually can't refute that, and that's not what this argument is specifically designed to do. So I know people who feel very connected to the divine, very connected to whatever transcendental divine presence that may or may not exist in this universe. And the goal of the rational theistic gambler is, what if you didn't have that? What if you were entirely objective? And obviously that's hard to simulate through a thought experiment 100%, but I think it's an interesting starting point. Yeah, so just to underscore this point to Darren, when did we determine that being a theist is rational? Why should anyone think that theism, I know you said thing, but I think you mean think, that theism is a rational position in the first place? Oh, let me just make sure my speaker is turned off so I don't get any feedback. There we go. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that is a legitimate question that could be placed before the question of the CTF argument, right? So you could say, well, wait a second, I haven't actually defined that theism is rational. But here's the reason why I thought that this wouldn't dissuade me from proposing this as a thought experiment and subsequent academic style, historiographic style analysis. I think you could put any number of questions before this question, right? So you could say, how can we know anything? How can we determine anything spiritually? That's another reasonable question that you could ask before this. How can any knowledge be ascertained, right? So there's almost really, if you think about it, an infinite number of questions that can be used to answer the CTF with an argument that basically it's limited because there's another question that goes before this fork in the decision making tree. So I don't necessarily disagree with that perspective. If that's the perspective that you have, I think it's reasonable to say that theism is a non-starter for me. Okay, so there's no way that you could put yourself in the rational theistic gambler paradigm. Now, here's the reason why I chose this personally. Number one, it's more relevant to me. Number two, it's more relevant to at least some of the viewers of my channel. I know some of the viewers of my channel really respect that I'm coming from a perspective of calibrated uncertainty and epistemic humility. And the next reason is that this sort of reflects my own stance in a very specific way. In other words, I think that I'm more certain that if a religion is true, that that religion is likely Christianity, than I am that there is a God. And I've talked about this before in some other videos and some other conversations, but I'm probably maybe 55, 60% certain that the universe has some sort of consciousness within it or without it that can be defined as God. But I'm and so it's only about like 55, 60%, maybe even between 50 and 55%. So it's not as much certainty that I have for that question. But once you get to the point that you believe in a rational theistic gambler, once you're in the situation where you say, I am committed, now I believe that there is a God, I think it's reasonable to say that at least some people who are in that position might be interested in this question. I also think from a purely academic perspective, this is an interesting question to ask. So I think it's interesting to ask the question, is where does the historiographic information point? So it's a legitimate question. It's arguably a legitimate criticism of the CTF, but I think that the criticism is overridden by the fact that this set of arguments is going to be relevant to some people. I just want to remind Darren, Dr. Kurt, and other people who may be watching that the link to join the chat is also in this chat itself. So the link is in this conversation, and it's also in the video description. So feel free to join the chat if you're so inclined. Let me take one more question from Dr. Kurt. Is this an argument only for people who accept a deity already that is not a deist Spinoza God? Because it seems like a non-starter without that. All right, now this is a much more difficult question to answer, okay? So, again, Max, feel free to like stop and ask questions as well. And I see Dr. Kurt in the chat. I'll add him to the stage, but now I don't want to get too distracted because there's a lot of slides to go through, but I'll go ahead and add Dr. Kurt. But let me try to answer this question in a better way. Let me take one more question before I do this one because it relates to Darren's last question. Why are you assuming that history points to anything true? When did we get an actual God to query? Yeah, I think, again, this is a reasonable perspective that you could say that is a question which should be answered prior to the rational theistic gambler perspective. But my question is, if you've already superseded this question, what would you decide? So again, it sort of is related to the same things that I've been saying for the last 2 or 3 minutes as I've been addressing this. All right, now let's talk about the issue of the Spinozan God, or a deist. What would a deist be able to decide? Now, I actually depart from many people with theistic perspectives on this. So, Dr. Kurt, you're in the chat. If you want, you can like phrase this question differently or interpret it. Or,
well, I would just say that from my perspective, like a deist and Spinoza's God and atheism are indistinguishable from an empirical standpoint. You're just responding to all the data with slightly different personal affinities, depending on how you want to phrase your belief set. But in all cases, the answer to what would be different in this situation is going to be the same between those three positions.
Yes and no. Well, let me ask you this question. It kind of seems like what you're saying is, what if you believe in a non-interventionist God? Is that a fair way to sort of rephrase this question? Is the
Yeah,
CTF
sure. The
still-
Epicurean gods, or a non-interventionist God, or a deist God, or Spinoza's God, these are all gods who don't change anything about the facts of the universe. So I don't think they're detectable.
Yeah, so the argument that I've made in the past, that I'll make again, is that I don't think a theistic universe with an omnitemporal, omnipotent, omniscient God can be distinguished from a deistic universe with a cosmic watchmaker type God. Okay, and here's why. And I've had this conversation with a lot of people, so I'm recapping some points, and I'll try to recall what I've said in the past. But um, let's say that God is omnitemporal, omniscient, omnipotent, and the creator of the universe. Okay, so I'm combining 4 different features, admittedly. If God made all the rules of reality, all the rules of nature, would we ever expect God to necessarily intervene to supersede those rules? Now, there is a specific relativistic region to believe that that God is is omnitemporal if God is ubiquitous. In other words, if God is omnipresent, then to occupy every aspect of space, God would also need to occupy every instant of time. Does that make sense? Like, in other words, if you believe in Minkowski space-time, to be present at all locations in space, you have to also be present at all instances of time. Does that make sense, at least
I mean,
from a
that's
relativistic
it's
perspective?
kind of off in the weeds, because I just don't see. I see a huge distinction between a theist God and a deist God, and the big difference is that the theist God would take action within the universe, and the deist God would not. So you're trying to. I think you're
But
going with
if
a
the
different definition than is typically understood for those terms from my.
all right, admittedly, that's true. And what I have is maybe not a different definition, but a different sort of reconciliation. I did see, Darren, that you joined the chat. I'll happily put you in. I just if you want to rejoin, or if you want to wait till later, since we're kind of in the middle of a deep issue. So okay, all right. Just shout out to TNC Apologetics, and just so you know, TNC, I am currently outnumbered 3-1. So if you'd like to join the channel, you're welcome to, TNC, just to make the conversation a little bit more balanced, but no pressure. I will try to join your channel also on Wednesday if I can't make it tomorrow. So shout out to TNC Apologetics. Great channel. We've had some great conversations over there. All right. So now let's get back to the question of, is an omnitemporal, omnipresent, omnipotent God who created the universe, who created the laws of reality, distinguishable from a non-interventionist deistic type God? And
I mean, let me be clear. Like, for me, omnipotence means an ability to take action, which, like, is one of the defining characteristics of the theist God that's distinct from the deist God, who either by nature or by ability does not take action.
yeah, well, do you know sort of the thought experiment of Laplace's demon? You know, that hemodynamic thought experiment that we studied in, like,
Yeah,
undergraduate
I'm
physics?
familiar with that, but
Yeah. So the idea is this: if God is omnitemporal, then if God wanted to intervene in 2026, he could easily do it by intervening at the starting point of the universe. Let me give you just one example of the thought experiment. Let's say I say, God, if you're real, please put a sandwich right outside my door, right? And then I open the door, right? And there's a sandwich there. Okay. Now, you could trace the history of that sandwich, and you could say, well, this actually didn't just magically appear here. It's because, there was a delivery and somebody got the details wrong. But if you're an omnipotent, omniscient, omnitemporal God, then the sequence of events that started off that error could be as old as the universe itself, right? So in other words, every detail would be traceable. And this isn't just me theologically pontificating. This is a real physics-based thought experiment. Let me give you one other example. Okay, if you're holding the universe in your hand, okay, and let's say that time is operating like the two-dimensional surface of the universe. This isn't that far off from the physics of Gerard de Tooft and Leonard Susskind, and you're watching that universe, right? You wouldn't perceive time as in the universe as the same thing that you're experiencing. In other words, you would look at that globe that you're holding in your hand, that sphere, and say and perceive different points at the surface of the globe as different instants in time, but you would be perceiving them simultaneously, right? So here's the thought experiment that I've posed, because a lot of people who are atheists kind of have this as a non-starter, where they say there should be no evidence for any miracles. You should never be able to circumvent anything naturalistic in the universe. And my starting point for that is, if you're God and you created the laws of the universe and you're omniscient and omnipotent, you would never need to then circumvent those very laws in order to achieve a desired outcome, right? Because you're omnitemporal. You could intervene at any point in the history of humankind, and it would be perceived as originating from the beginning of the universe. Let me give you two more thought experiments, because I think it'll help you elucidate this. The parting of the Red Sea. Every historian agrees that may be an event that, actually, let's just say if it happened, they agree that it could have happened through naturalistic events, right? The Red Sea could have parted from a
I'm
wind.
sorry, that there's broad scholarly consensus that the entire Exodus narrative never took place.
Yeah. So I'm starting from the thought experiment that this is a presumption that it did, right? Okay. So every historian agrees that if it did happen, okay, that it could have happened from naturalistic events.
Well, I wouldn't say every historian, because there are plenty of confessional conservative historians who believe it as it is written.
Well, that would still fall under, they believe if it happened, then it could have happened from naturalistic events.
No, they believe it happened as a miracle because they believe in miracles.
Okay, well, but I mean, I don't think that what I'm saying is any necessarily different from miracle, depending on which definition that you use. All right, let's say we're looking at this from a geologist lens. Okay,
if you're saying a miracle is an event that happened because of physics.
Well, let's take this a step back, because I don't want to.
Then it's going to happen naturally. But if you're saying a miracle is happening because God is actually changing the local structures through means that don't involve chemistry, physics, and local conditions, then that's how do you make standard understanding of a miracle is on the part of most people who believe.
Well, how do you make that delineation?
Well, I don't think you can. I don't think miracles.
Well, that's exactly my point. That's exactly my point. You've proven my whole point with this, which is that if God is omnitemporal, then God could have intervened on any point in the timeline to have a desired outcome in the future of our timeline. So in other words, God could have intervened.
Again, if you hold to B theory, that's not an intervention.
How is it not an intervention? It's reacting to events.
Well, on B theory, no, because there's no reaction. On B theory, the entire chunk of space-time exists. There's nothing to change because it all exists.
Oh, are you talking about like the B theory against like presentism?
Against A theory,
every block
travel through time, that all points in the block of space-time exist.
Yeah, well, let's assume that from the standpoint of our reality, that only the present moment is real, because I understand what you're saying, that there's physics-based and real scientific explanations that could suggest that every moment in the past and present and future is all real. But let's start from the standpoint of presentism, just for purposes of this thought experiment. And I realize that I'm laying a lot of criteria on the thought experiment, but the idea is basically this: if God is indeed omnitemporal, omniscient, then there could be an intervention at the beginning of the universe, which would have a very specific outcome in the year 2026. And if God is the architect of all the laws of nature, we would expect that God would never necessarily need to circumvent those laws of physics written by God in order to produce any specific desired outcome.
Yeah, I think that's just such a wild chain of. I just don't think you can demonstrate that there's a way to construct a universe to make something like that take place. But I don't dispute that it's like not logically possible. It's logically possible.
There is actually a way to do this, right? Which is just through higher dimensions.
Yeah,
right?
I don't. Again, I'm certainly not an expert on the physics of that, and I won't claim to be. But I do think that like the physics of the world that we inhabit in our regular four-dimensional space is chaotic enough that to do the calculations to create that sort of coherence or to make that sort of event as a planned event would require an immense amount of compute that would create an immense amount of heat.
Well, that's a fair criticism, but remember, if God is omnitemporal, then there's two problems. Number one, the degree of compute actually decreases exponentially as the dimensions are simplified, right? Again, Susskind and Gerard de Tooft have demonstrated that the information in the universe is proportional to a lower dimensional matrix on the event horizon of the universe. Now it sounds like pseudoscience, it sounds like woo, but that's an actual pretty accurate depiction of their resolution of the black hole theory wars. But the point is,
I've heard you on this. I can see how at a black hole interface that might be the case, and I'm certainly going to grant that that is the case at the interface of a black hole. But you're talking about a sandwich coming outside a hotel door. That's like a totally different level of calculation, because at a black hole interface, you're going to preserve just due to the way the physics works in that particular location. But the way the physics works on the Earth is very different.
well, I mean, I'll grant you that this theoretical model might require a lot of compute. I mean, I'm happy to grant that. I think it's not quite as hard as it seems, and the reason is because the entire timeline is being observed from the outside of our universe. In other words, an observer outside of our universe wouldn't be subject to the rules of our timeline.
Yeah, but that assumes facts, not an evidence. I mean, you have to assume there is the possibility of an observer outside our universe, and I just don't know that that's a possibility. I'm not saying it's logically impossible. I'm just saying it's not logically proven to be possible.
I mean, there's evidence that I would say points in that direction, but it's not.
Well, what's the definition of universe? It's everything that ever was and everything that ever is, right? Unless you use Carl Sagan's definition that our universe is our local instantiation and the cosmos is everything that ever was and ever is and ever will be. But in either case, there's some structure that must include all extant things, right?
Well, I mean, I could use Alan Guth's model of the inflationary cosmology, which suggests that our universe is just a bubble, one among many.
Yeah. But then the cosmos would be the collective noun for all of them. But again, there's going to be a noun.
Not necessarily. No. Our
right?
cosmos would just be our own bubble universe.
Well, then, okay, but there's a collective noun in your system for everything that exists, right?
Well, the problem is if you're saying everything that exists, you could mean everything that exists in our universe or everything that exists.
No, everything that has reality, period.
So that includes dimensions outside of our own reality?
It would include all things that exist. Let's make a new term. Let's call it all things that exist. You now have all things that exist as a term that you can use.
Yeah,
there's no way for there to be anything that's not in that set, right?
That's true. Okay, but let's back up just because I want to sort of zoom back in on the rational theistic gambler paradigm because we've now gone pretty far. So
yeah, right. So this is my point about like the rational theistic gambler. To me, still, I think there are certainly intellectually satisfying models of the existence of a God that would not have any truck with any theism of any type. Right? Spinoza's God doesn't take action.
I guess the question that I'm meaning to ask, or the contention that I'm making, is this rational theistic gambler paradigm doesn't necessarily compel anyone to reject a deistic universe. In other words, you don't have to say I'm a deist. You don't have to say I'm not a deist to embark on this thought experiment of the rational theistic.
Yeah, that's so you're saying that someone who has like an opinion like Spinoza's God where God, that is to say nature, exists, which is just like, that's a vibe check. You're making an argument that this should apply to anybody, right? Because to me, there's not that much difference between Spinoza's God and an atheist.
I don't know that I would agree with that. I think of Spinoza's God as sort of a more deistic perspective, but look, there's a lot of different definitions of atheism. There's closed atheism, there's open atheism, there's sort of atheists who believe in like panpsychonism and universal consciousness, but they don't believe in God.
Yeah.
So it gets into if you say this is not something that an atheist would believe, I don't think I would be willing to be that committal about it.
No. Atheism is just, well, my definition of atheism is that you're somebody who doesn't accept the current most popular understanding of God. I think it's a sociological term, much more than it is a philosophical.
Well, what gets used in the literature is there are different definitions than that get used in the literature. For instance, sometimes people talk about closed atheism as people who have very high certainty that there is no God. And
right, but you brought up Wittgenstein. So on Wittgenstein, the meaning is the usage, and the usage usually is, I don't accept the dominant understanding of the God. That's why Christians were called atheists, because the dominant understanding in the earlier Roman Empire was of a polytheistic group of gods that everybody believed in, and the Christians didn't believe in those gods, so they were called atheists.
Yeah, that's true. That's actually a really good point. Atheiatikos. That was the Greek slander against the Christians. Yeah, that's a good point. All right. Well, I think we have a consensus that you can be a deist and you can at least embark on this thought experiment. Or you can believe in a Spinozan type God or a non-interventionalist God for that matter. My personal perspective on God is that if there is a God, God is probably omnitemporal. Okay, all right. Well, let's get to some more comments. Darren put this comment in the chat just to clarify: is the CTF meant to point to the truthfulness of the Christian religion and therefore an argument for the Christian God existing? I think the answer to this question is yes, if I take point to in a certain specific way. In other words, I think that the objective academic evidence points to Christianity being the highest epistemic starting point. But again, I don't know that the CTF argument is a claim of truthfulness of the Christian religion for atheists. In other words, I think I could see an atheist looking at these arguments and being very unsatisfied by any of them and saying, if you start with anything theological, that's a non-starter for me. I could see an atheist legitimately coming to that perspective. I could also see somebody because for some reason, the CTF argument has had the highest Muslim engagement out of any of my videos. So that's been really interesting for me to watch. But I could see somebody looking at this argument and saying, this is automatically a non-starter because and they're not saying this in the same terms that I'm saying it, but I could see somebody saying, this whole argument is a non-starter for me because I believe that my subjective experience tells me that Islam is the correct religious perspective, and I could see that being a wholly valid perspective. My question is more narrow than saying Christianity is therefore the truth. It's more narrow than that. But I do think that an atheist has a bit of a hard time looking at all the criteria of the CTF argument for a few different reasons. All right, good. Another question. An atheist wouldn't come to that conclusion because of the theism bias. It's a legitimate point. I would agree. Yeah, a lot of atheists are going to look at this argument and say non-starter. I think the things that have really been fascinating for me with this video that I made about the CTF argument is, number one, people on all sides of the theological spectrum. I think, Max, you commented on this. And again, Max, if you have anything that you want to weigh in with, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask any questions. But I think one of the things is that everyone seems to be considering it to be a very novel set of arguments. That to me is a compliment, even if nothing else. Number two, the other interesting thing is I'm engaging with a lot of audiences from this video who had no idea who I was before this, who seem very wrapped up in this argument, who are responding with a lot of different emotions that are very strong. So I've found that to be sort of an interesting and compelling thing. Now, I do have some comments that I wanted to get to, but let's keep going through the slides. And again, people can interrupt me or stop me or ask me questions. All right, so that was a long discussion about the rational theistic gambler paradigm. If you want to know what inspired this, if anyone's familiar with John Rawls' A Theory of Justice, that is sort of an inspiration for this perspective. In other words, if you're behind the veil of ignorance, what would you decide? That's sort of an example of that. And let me put shout out to 21st Century Apologetics. He's made now 2 different videos on the CTF argument. So Klein bottles can exist in 4D space, but can't be seen in 3D space. That's a valid and interesting point. Yeah, I think that was a little backtracking a little bit to what we were on when that comment popped up. So I apologize that I didn't get to it sooner. All right. Now I've divided the arguments into empirical and qualitative. So empirical are the things that I think I can cleanly compare across religious traditions. And the qualitative are the arguments that these are ways that, Christianity would be specifically unique, but would appeal to the rational theistic gambler paradigm. Now, these aren't meant to be fixed categories, and that's another thing that I didn't get to in the video, but the qualitative categories are sort of things that are distinctive about Christianity. But I think it'd be really, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but I think it'd be really interesting to start to move some of these qualitative arguments into the empirical category by looking at parallelisms from other religion. So in other words, one of the things in the qualitative argument is the degree to which Christianity was an inflection point in Jewish spiritual, liturgical, and religious experience around the year 30 CE. So I think that's a very interesting standpoint. Now, I could look at effects on adjacent religious traditions and apply that to other religions, and that would be a way of moving some of these qualitative distinctive things back into the empirical category. So that is something that I hope to do eventually. This isn't grant-funded research, and my resources are limited. So I felt like some of these arguments were important, they're distinctive, but they're not as sussed out as they would need to be. And again, any of you can unmute yourselves and ask any questions. All right, I'll skip over the overview for now because hopefully you've seen the video. By the way, if you haven't seen this video, it's got almost 4,000 views. It's my most popular video so far. I would love it if you checked out the video. The video is in the channel description, so and the YouTube description for this video. So in other words, if you're watching this video and you don't know what we're talking about with CTF, click on the description of this video and it'll take you back to the video that we're all talking about here. All right, now
one quick point I would make though is that the original video is really just a sort of the broad categories listed out. I think it's 4 main points. And then you subdivide that later in later videos into the smaller list of initially 10 and now 13. So the initial videos, it's quite good in terms of expressing your position. Again, I'm so happy to have an evidentiary argument, but it's hard to suss out exactly what the 10 are from the initial video.
Yeah, so that's a correct. So first of all, thank you again for the kind words. I'm really actually quite surprised that so many atheists are like saying kind things about this. Even like, I know Max, you had some kind things to say, even though you were like, you're still wrong, and I still disagree. I still really appreciate the compliments, even though people are like,
no, I'm just exhausted of precept arguments. But
yeah, yeah. Okay.
Well, I take evidence, so that's amazing.
I'm sure I can exhaust you of CTF, but I'll try at least. All right, but good, yeah. But that's a valid point. This is actually my 3rd iteration of the CTF argument. So, and I suspect that there will be more iterations. And already some people have given me valid pushback on some of the things. So, but I mean, here's my point. And this people had. I know Max probably has some stuff to say about this, and Darren does as well. So, would atheism predict a clear winner in the CTF analysis? So my argument is that it might, but that would need to be explained. But I don't think that would be predicted tabula rasa. Now, let me again give you an analogy that's a thought experiment. Let's say I'm looking at 13 different hospitals, and I have about 13 different, because there's about 13 religions in the CTF argument. And let's say I have 13 different criteria for those hospitals. If you had any one criteria, I don't think you'd have very high confidence if you said, well, this hospital is the best performer in this one criteria. Now, certainly when we rank hospitals, we do it with criteria that are very overarching, like morbidity and mortality. So those are fairly overarching criteria that encompass a bunch of qualitative factors. But I think if you start stacking criteria, then you have a more compelling argument that the hospital that ranks the best is indeed the best hospital. Now, let's say there's one hospital that across all the criteria ranks at the top. I think you'd have more confidence saying this is probably the best hospital. Now, that doesn't mean that that conclusion is proven, right? Another hospital could say, well, these criteria are biased or they're abnormally selected. We'll get to that in just a moment. But if the hospital said that, I think that's not the end of the discussion. I think the end of the discussion is then showing that the criteria instantiate a certain bias. In other words, if another hospital comes by and says, well, you're looking at criteria that are biased, I think that hospital then assumes sort of at least some of the burden of proof for showing that the criteria are themselves biased. Hopefully that makes sense. So I think the point is this. An atheist might predict that if you had one criteria that there could be an outlier. I mean, data can certainly be clumpy. That's fine. But I don't think an atheist would predict a clear winner in the CTF analysis because I'm looking at so many different criteria, and the likelihood of one winner emerging from each of the criteria goes down geometrically as we stack on our criteria. So hopefully that makes sense. So,
yeah, I would just say I would predict exactly the opposite. Like you have founder effects, first mover effects, and snowballs. So you would expect, just like there's like languages that are dominant and other languages that have been pushed out of the linguistic marketplace. And just like there are government styles that are dominant and there are government styles that have been pushed out of the political marketplace, in exactly the same way, you're going to see that with everything. You're going to see it with industry. You're going to see it with media. You're going to see it with, which side of the road people drive on. There's going to be a majority and minority because that's how sociology and people work. They like to be part of a winning team and they like to be part of a large group. I mean, I don't know if you have ever lived in Europe, but in Europe, like there's a very small number of soccer teams that actually have passionate fans, and most of the rest of them are just like either local fan bases that are very regional specific, or they just don't have very many fans at all. And the only way they make money is that they get the big teams that have a lot of fans to come visit them. And it's the same sort of thing happening here, I think.
well, here's a better way to sort of defer that analogy. Imagine you're looking at soccer teams and you ask somebody who is the best soccer team, right? You might get a lot of different answers, and a lot of those answers would depend on popularity, right? Here's what the CTF tries to do. It
Like,
tries.
who's the best Socrates? Do you mean like Sophocles Socrates versus
I
Plato's
apologize.
Socrates? Or?
No, I apologize. I said soccer team. Who is the best?
Oh, soccer team. Okay. Who's the best soccer team? Yeah. Well, that's arguably that's going to be decided with the Champions League, right?
Yeah, arguably, but there's several. I think you could say that if we disaggregate it, there are several different metrics, right? You could say who has the best,
sure.
who's the best center, who's the best, goalie, who's the best, at this, who's the best at that. So I think the point of CTF isn't to say like, okay, here's a ranking system and here's an outlier. The point is to spread it out among evaluative criteria. Now, the first part of your response was a really persuasive deflection. You're saying that you're sort of collapsing some of the criteria. You're saying this all depends on just popularity. It's all popularity contest, essentially. And that's kind of where I thought you were going initially. And I don't want to straw man your position. I'm just saying that there are two ways to deflect against the atheist, the fact that atheists wouldn't predict a clear winner. One is to say that that these are all different criteria, but they all stem from the same thing, right? The other is that, well, this is just a statistical outlier. The problem with the statistical outlier argument is it doesn't really, and again, 21st century apologetics. I'm glad you're in the chat. I have you muted just because I know sometimes you have audio issues where you're at, but feel free to wave. And Dr. Kurtz had a few responses, but Max, Darren, I hope you'll consider voicing your opinion. My point is this, though: as you spread out the evaluative criteria and keep all those evaluative criteria separate, I think there's a stronger argument to be made that it is less likely that one of the religions would stand out. Now, here's the other part of the evidence for that. If you look across the other 12 religions that I evaluate in CTF, they all do quite well in some categories and quite poorly in other categories. So Christianity is sort of unique across the board in that it does all quite well in all of the different categories. Now, I think that's at least an observation that requires an explanation. Now, I'm not saying
Well,
it's
you picked the categories.
well, I picked the categories, but when I started doing this, but you can't just say you're biased and you pick the categories. You have to show that the categories instantiate bias.
Sure.
Right. So, and here's the other point. When I started doing this research, a lot of these arguments were things that I was uncovering during my period as being very, very agnostic. Now, here's the other reason why you can't say, well, you're just biased and you pick categories and this is all curve fitting. I think that's a very valid perspective. There is no way that I can prove to you that I didn't p-hack this data. In other words, there's no way that I can prove to you that I didn't have a bunch of criteria sitting in front of me and I picked out the ones where Christianity performed the best at. I can attest to you that that wasn't my experience. I was really legitimately surprised that every time I tried a criteria, Christianity won out. I think that's a really, I was surprised by that. Now, the better way to prove you wrong on this count is by people suggesting other criteria and me testing those out. So, for example, Darren suggested the criteria of internal consistency. We haven't finished talking about that, Darren, but I think that's a reasonable criteria that you could put into CTF. I think it'd be reasonable to put that criteria into CTF and see how the religions do. I'll even say that I suspect that Christianity wouldn't perform the best if that were your criteria.
Tavo, I have to apologize. I am hopelessly pedantic. When you're using the singular, if you can just make me not cringe every time you say criteria, just say criterion.
Oh, criterion is the singular.
I
actually did that. I actually did that correctly in the video, but that's totally fine. Okay. Here's the point. Darren suggested an additional criterion, and that criterion was internal consistency. Now, we haven't finished talking about that, but the challenge is operationalizing that, right? So, and then the challenge is also mitigating the other criteria by selecting that criteria. So there's a bunch of challenges in using internal consistency. For instance, this is just one layer of the challenge. But if you say Christianity is not consistent because, this conflicts with this, and then an apologetical resolution comes out that sort of harmonizes those standpoints, does that count as a standing inconsistency? Or do you just say, well, any tension that exists counts as an inconsistency? I think it's challenging to sort of, in other words, I think it's a great criteria. I would argue that it's very difficult to operationalize. I'm working at it, and I've tried to work at it. But the other way to show that this isn't biased is for people to do their own CTF style analysis, or to suggest to me other criteria that we can add on. Like I said, this is the third iteration of the CTF argument, and it certainly does not need to be the last. So I'm happy to keep truth finding criteria before I put in consistency. I would put in truth finding criteria. Yeah, I mean, that's again, that's I would argue that across religions that's hard to operationalize, but I think it'd be interesting. If you require harm unionization, then you are admitting that there are inconsistencies that need to be fixed.
I would say apparent inconsistencies, but yeah, I think that's to some degree true. But I mean, like explanation is sort of like lionized and given all kinds of like power in these sorts of discussions. But explanation is just adequate when the person you're talking to stops asking further questions. It doesn't really tell you anything about the adequacy of the explanation. It tells you about the psychology of the receiver of the explanation.
Oh, that's a valid counterpoint. I mean, that's true. That's true of religions and atheism. I think.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree.
I think James has something to say. So, James, you're unmuted.
Yeah, I really like all of the counterpoints that Alan. I'm thinking the guy in the hat is Alan. That's who it looked like in the.
You can call me Kurt.
Okay, great.
Do you want to be called Dr. Kurt? I'm happy to.
Oh, I don't care.
Okay, all right.
Dr. Kurt, I'm happy with that. Yeah, my thing is, and this crosses into like almost politics or something, but it's what I call the colonization of Indo-European languages. You've got so many, and a lot of these religions, like you can see on my channel. I know Tavo's looked at some of them, where I continually bring up the difference between Hebrew and Greek, and the difference between Greek and Navajo, and the difference between English and Navajo and Hebrew and Greek, and all this. Is that I heard you mention Wittgenstein, so I'm assuming you're familiar with what I'm talking about. That your language forms your framework for how you're going to perceive reality. And Wittgenstein.
I mean, to a degree, I don't mean to interrupt, but to a degree, I don't disagree that it does have some effect. But right. I hold to the language of thought hypothesis, where I do think that languages largely are transformative. But there are certainly cases like the Native American languages that don't have left, right, and front and back, but only use the cardinal directions. That's going to create fundamentally different brain structures for speakers than people who use left, right, front, and back. So I agree to a limited amount that yes.
Well, no, it's actually because they're verb-centric.
Yeah, verb-centric. Again, I grant you that verb-centric and all that matters, but I still think there is a language of thought that has to be translated by the.
Well, this is where I go into. This is where I go into David Bohm, because David Bohm, he's one of our most respected physicists, and he said that these noun-centric languages are just not sufficient to describe what science is now encountering, particularly in quantum physics. All right, so he tried to create a language called the RIA mode, which would convert English terms into a verb-centric language as an experiment to show people what the difference is, that you're not really understanding this the fundamental reality that we're now learning about the universe in these noun-centric languages. Now that's shoot, that I mean, that is really difficult for your brain to wrap around. It's difficult for me. I'm constantly fighting. Well, how do I do this? And particularly in these theistic arguments, like I kept hearing brought up omnipotence. All right, now if you look at it, you can't be omnipotent unless you're also omniscient, and you can't be either omnipotent or omniscient unless you're omnipresent. So it's basically a three-dimensional category. But now, is that three dimensions all that we can see, or is that just the surface holographic level that we suppose? It raises the question of whether atheism or theism, as we have standardly positioned them as binaries, is even legitimate anymore. And I honestly, I don't consider that it is. There's a lot of things that atheists have to say that I consider way more legitimate than theists, and some things that theists say that I consider more legitimate than atheists. I'm kind of like in this twilight zone right here, and I don't know. I really don't know how to interact with people that are not.
Well, let me try to drive the conversation a little bit back towards CTF, but I want to give a plug to 21st Century Apologetics video on the CTF argument. There were actually two different videos. There's one that I've seen, and there's at least one that I haven't seen, I don't think. So I think actually I've seen two, and there's a third one that I haven't seen. So, but they're really great to check out. You should also check out his video that goes into a little more depth on what you're hearing right now, which is the conversation about verb-centric versus noun-centric languages. It inspired me to start learning biblical Hebrew, which I'm pretty far along on now at this point. I'm actually not bad at like sounding out words in biblical Hebrew. So, all right, let's do.
Let me say one more thing on that, and then I'm going to leave. Then I'm going to leave.
Oh, okay,
I
okay.
just want to say this, and then I'm going to leave. All right. On that, and this is what I encountered, because my favorite channel for learning Hebrew, if you want to learn Hebrew, it's called Aleph with Beth, because they take you. It's only Hebrew. They don't tell you this Hebrew word means this. Anyway, you can check it out if you want to. But as I started watching that, I started seeing this big collision, and I'm sure probably if y'all have heard of Michael Heiser. And Michael Heiser was an expert on Hebrew before he died. God rest his soul. And I raised a lot of questions with Heiser that he didn't want to address, which had to do with this verb-centric perspective, because that is the real fundamental difference there. And it doesn't have to be focused necessarily on Hebrew. I mean, if you're going to do biblical studies, yeah, it should. But the study itself has to do with the difference between verb-centric language and noun-centric language. And I'm going to leave off here, and I'm going to go back to watching my movie. I was into reruns of Breaking Bad. So,
Okay.
One
Yeah.
last thing before you go, 21st Century Apologetics. I
Yep.
would, if you have not had a chance to ever read him, read a German philosopher, Fritz Maufner, who I think is really the precursor for much of the linguistic critique of Wittgenstein in his later form. His original book, the Beitrage zur eine Sprachkritik, is really an excellent book. And now with like the modern AI translators, you can just go to the German and punch it into a translator, or just have the page translated. And it's not bad at getting the main ideas. Some of it's bad, but you can sort it out. And he's incredibly good. I view him very similar to Karl Marx, right? He's great at diagnosis. He's terrible at treatment.
Yeah. I know exactly what you mean by that. Yep.
All right, well, let's do some quick comments. Let's just give a shout out to Teach Yahweh, or Teach YHWH. I appreciate the hello. Thanks for commenting on the video also. I really appreciate that. Voyage Apologetics. I'm now very outnumbered by the atheists in the room, so if you want to hop on, you're absolutely welcome to. I know that you hop into some of these chats. Let's do a question. Oh, and let's just thanks Joey NECT, who I think discovered my channel just earlier today. I appreciate you popping by and joining this conversation. Let's do a quick question from Christian Guitar 206. What do you think about comparing modern miracle claims between religions as a metric or a criterion for CTF? I actually think that this is a good suggestion. The problem is in data mining. There is actually a repository of information of modern miracle healings. The Catholic Church does the best job of keeping records of healings. So if you had to look at the literature around healings, you would say that there's more Christian healings and there's more Catholic healings than other Christian healings. But other religions will claim healing events, and I think that the Catholic Church does the best at documenting them. I actually was involved in a case where somebody recovered spontaneously from widely metastatic renal malignancy, and it was a case that went to the archdiocese. So I think it's an interesting question to ask. I'd love to get into like a conversation about healing miracles. I'm not sure that would bring me any definitive conclusions. Thanks very much, Joey Necht. And if anyone else on the panel wants to weigh in on this, I've looked into this a fair degree. I think the stuff on healing miracles is really fascinating. I don't know that it really brings me a lot of theological clarity, because you can always go back to the explanation that the Catholic Church just keeps the best records. Any other thoughts from the panel?
Well, they keep the best Christian records, and they don't actually verify that they actually happened. They just do claims. So if you want to actually make that part of your criteria, you need to verify that it actually happened.
Well,
Because
That is factually incorrect, Aaron. They do keep imaging. I know for a fact that they keep imaging records, they keep pathology records. So there's a lot of documentation of clinical records. Now, they may not interview the patients and test the patients themselves, but they keep, like, for instance, the CT scans and, ocular scans and fundoscopic images and stuff. So
Yeah, I'm just not impressed until you can verify that it actually happened, and it's outside of the range of people that just get better normally. Then, I mean, you might as well. What was that? You can go to YouTube and find all sorts of healing videos of people actually performing that kind of stuff online, but you don't believe any of the other religions are actually doing any healing. And if healing was actually a thing, then hospitals would have miracle healing wings, not, and it would be considered a real thing rather than just a theological curiosity.
well, I mean, first of all, hospitals do have chaplains, and second of all, people have
Yeah,
actually.
but chaplains don't heal people. The doctors don't trust the chaplain to go in and actually heal people.
Well,
They do call chaplains to code blues, though.
Yeah, but that's for the family, not for they don't like actually
But they
expect
do
the
call
doctor, the chaplain to actually be healing anyone. Otherwise, they wouldn't have all the doctors in there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is fascinating research on what you're saying, Darren. It's a really fascinating set of, in other words, these people who are on TV who have these mega churches who do faith healings. Now, I want to underscore that I've spoken out against mega churches several times in the past, and I've also spoken out against this sort of faith healing tradition. But when they actually interview those patients and say, "Did you feel better?" they'll say yes. But when there's did your symptoms actually improve? The answer is always, even among people who are very theological, very, very fanatical about their religion and very fundamentalist, for instance, they'll admit there was no actual robust healing that took place. It was more of a spiritual healing. So if they'll heal people with like rheumatoid arthritis, and the person feels immediately better, and it looks very impressive. But when people have done those studies, even the people who are very pro the religions that are healing them, even those individuals are like, yeah, I didn't actually get healed. I just sort of felt a little better transiently, and it was more of a spiritual healing.
Yeah, I got a dopamine hit that reduces pain and for a little while, and once that goes away, then it's all back again.
But I do think it's categorically distinct from the Catholic healing miracles that are documented. But Dr. Kurt, you're a physician, so feel free to weigh in.
Have you read Damasio's book on Descartes' error in the somatic marker hypothesis?
No.
It's a great book. If you get a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. But within that framework, you're just going to have a limbic system that is going to determine salience on the basis of factors that may not even be within the awareness field consciously of the person who's experiencing the events. And so the limbic system is going to be incredibly powerful at mobilizing, non-cognitively addressable portions of the physical body. And I think that that's far too underestimated in any of this discussion, right? We have a very good understanding of many parts of physiology, but we certainly don't have a comprehensive understanding of how the limbic system interacts with various anti-infectious and anti-malignant portions of our physiology. Well, it may be beyond our ability to investigate.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think some of these interactions are so idiosyncratic that our sample sizes would be too small. But I think it's a good question, Christian Guitar 206. Just one more thing that I want to underscore, that I've seen some details on cases that I think are very impressive. They don't move the needle for me theologically, but I think they're very interesting to look at. Like, there was a patient with congenital aniridia, so congenital absence of the iris, who was spontaneously gained the ability to see. This is kind of interesting. I myself
spontaneously gain irises.
Did not spontaneously gain irises,
okay,
but was able to see in a way that defied, the explanation. The case that I was involved in was widely metastatic renal cell carcinoma, which has a very poor prognosis, and that spontaneously all regressed.
Right, but the immune modulating treatments for melanoma certainly are giving a proof of concept that a proper immune tagging of a tumor could certainly cause a spontaneous regression, given an immune system that had the ability to induce apoptosis, right? So it's not certainly a miracle. It
Well,
could
well, but
easily be
remember
natural.
though, remember that I said spontaneously. So in other
Yeah,
words, this was a
again,
case patient was not on any chemotherapy. Now, I will say that I was an atheist at the time, and I thought that was very impressive. But again, it did not move the needle for me theologically. And the reason why it didn't is because like you're saying, in a tiny minority of patients, you'll see that. How many cases of widely metastatic renal cell carcinoma have I seen? Probably
right?
dozens, if not hundreds. So I saw one that went away. So that's not, so maybe that was just a lucky patient that had. But I still think it's an interesting question to get into. And even if I don't, I mean, not all my content has to lead to a theistic conclusion. So Christian Guitar, I take that as a really good suggestion. We are at the 1 hour mark. So let me now maybe take a break, and let's go through all the panelists who are on, and let's do something a little different. I really wanted to get through more slides, but I suspect that we might get waylaid, which is fine. But let's have each of the panelists grade the CTF argument on 3 criteria. Number 1, does it do what it proposes to do? In other words, does it show that the rational theistic gambler would have a leaning? Okay, criterion number 2. Does it actually make Christianity in any way more plausible from an objective stance? So it's similar to number 1, but a little more wide. Number 3, does it move the needle for you at all? And let's have Max talk first, because Max, I've not heard you weigh in, and I'd love to know what you think about this.
So wait, the first criteria was
does the CTF do what it claims to do? Does it show the conclusion that it claims to show? In other words, does it show that the rational theistic gambler at the end of the analysis has a proclivity and is no longer in the neutral position?
I don't know. I mean, when I look at the strongest arguments, they also seem to collapse under closer inspection. I don't know that it really accomplishes the goal. I don't know how I would rate. I'd have to think about like every individual criterion. I don't know that I have a good answer to this.
Well, that's okay. I mean, but you can have answers to the other question. Does it move the needle for you? I'm going to guess no.
I don't think it does move it for me at all.
Well, that's okay. I mean, this is. So how would you grade it? A, B, C, D, F?
I think maybe I would give it,
or you could give it an I for incomplete, or.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it is incomplete, because it seems like, well, you could always come up with new criterion, and you could get rid of some, arguably. I don't know.
With new criteria.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's plural.
I mean, I don't know that you would ever be complete. There's almost always something you could add. I mean, I would be generous, and I'll say it's a C. Like, there are some points that seem pretty good.
I'll take a C. That's really, I think when you reflect on that further, you're going to say, no, the C is too generous, but I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah.
Okay, One more grade that you could give it is when I was in primary school, you could get a T, right? So T is for trying, right? So this was,
well, you're definitely trying.
The bottom of the class, you're really trying hard, and you want to reward your effort.
I don't know. I'd rather just dig into specific arguments rather than think about the entire thing. I had all these points planned.
Well, no problem. We're not out of time. I just thought, since we're at the 1 hour mark and you hadn't talked yet,
I was waiting to talk because I had points where I didn't even like the physics people were talking about. It was way above me. I didn't even want to talk about that. It was interesting, but
I promise I'll give you dedicated time, Max, because you've been here for an hour now, and
I mean, overall, I guess it's like you're trying hard, and there's some good points, but there's some things I'd like to push back on. But that's about it. Although someone else can talk if they want.
Yeah, we'll come back to Max, and we'll get to your points. Dr. Kurt?
So yes, 3 questions. Does it do what it claims? And then what grade would I give it? And then does it move the needle for me? Are those the 3?
Yeah, those are 3. Yeah, that's good. That's a good recap.
So for question 1, does it do what it claims? If by that you mean, does it make a case for Christianity for the rational theistic gambler? I would go ahead and say it certainly makes a case. So to the degree that it makes a case and it's based on evidence, again, like I'm all in favor of having evidence to discuss. It's much more interesting and fun. I would say it's you're calling a shot and then you're doing the thing you said you're going to do. To that degree, yes. Now that's a separate issue from does it accomplish the goal of convincing an atheist? I think it doesn't try to do that. And so I would just say that is not like something that it's trying to do, at least the way that I viewed it originally. So I would say no for that. And then I would give it a letter grade also. I mean, I'm not trying to like blow smoke here. But I would say of the arguments for Christian theism, it gets a C, and I would give every single other argument for Christian theism an F, because they're horrifically bad.
Okay, so a C, but an A+ if you grade on a curve.
Yeah, right. If I was grading on a curve, that's probably true.
Okay, all right. No, I'll take that. I think a C is very generous. Actually, I won't try to push for a higher grade. I think that's a very generous score.
I couldn't imagine myself giving a higher grade to a theist argument at the moment with the way my current set of affinities is constructed. But
and I'm guessing
I will certainly grant that I'm a human being who has a set of affinities, and those are probably driving some of my reasoning, which if you read Damasio's book, you'll see is the human condition. And then for me, does it move the needle? Not even the tiniest bit. No.
Okay, well, I mean, a C is that's still pretty. All right. Well, all right. And
what I appreciate is that it's an evidence-based effort to come up with an argument that actually is not just like sad. And it does actually look at the actual evidence that we have, which I feel like that's just been abandoned since about the mid-90s on most Christian apologetics. So I give it all kinds of props for that.
Okay, yeah, that's a very very kind analysis, and I'm actually very surprised. Okay, all right, Darren.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to be as nice as these 2 gentlemen.
I wouldn't expect it. Yeah.
If I was being honest, I'd give it your I for incomplete, mostly because I'm sorry, this is going to sound horrible, but I don't mean it that way. But mostly because I don't think it's logically coherent. For example, like you use the positive attestation as evidence of it being true, which means that any negative attestation would have to count as evidence against it, and you haven't done that.
What about the hostile, the antagonistic literature criteria?
Well, I would say you haven't used it correctly. Quoting Gandhi or whatever doesn't.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant the Jewish antagonistic literature tradition, like the Talmud, the Toledo Yeshu, Josephus.
Again, that's all. Those were all. I mean, you have no real evidence that they were talking about something they knew about. All you have is writings that came along decades, sometimes centuries later. So it's not like they were talking about something they actually knew about. All you can really say is they were talking about something that they were hearing from Christians, and you can do headcanon about, oh, he was, he had this position and he had access to this stuff. But I mean, all you really have are the writings, and the writings don't indicate that any of that got into his writings. So, I mean, you have to really speculate on a lot of it.
Okay. Well, what about so what about final grade? I'm guessing it doesn't move the needle for you at all as well.
Not in the way that you were hoping. No,
Yeah.
it moved in
I
the
don't know that
opposite
I was hoping
direction.
for anything. I mean, this is my own personal journey. I was hoping it would resonate with others, if it does at all, even if it's from a standpoint of disagreement, and if I've made them sort of think about something differently, I think I've accomplished the goal. So
Yeah,
I wasn't, in other words, I wasn't coming away from this saying, oh, this is going to make
yeah,
Darren convert to Christianity. But
yeah. No, I'm impressed with the amount of work you've put into it. That's more than, like Kurt said, that's more than any of the other apologists do. So, kudos for that.
well, I think you should upgrade me from an I for incomplete to a T for trying. So T for trying is like, that's what I got. I got in gym class when I was in primary school, right? 'Cause I was
Okay.
really bad at gym, and like they give you a T if you're like you're really bad, but you're
Well, I think incomplete is better than trying, because incomplete just means you have more work and you can actually get to finish it up. Trying is just sort of like a little pat on the head and like, oh, how cute. So,
How do you know that's not what my goal is?
well, if that's
No,
your
go
goal,
on, go
then
on.
I'm
Sorry.
sure you can accomplish it. You seem like a smart person.
To be clear, owls are hella cute.
I am not. That is not in the way I am similar to an owl. I look like an owl. I'm not. The cuteness is definitely not something that I. Yeah. All right. Well, but keep going, Darren. All right. So I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh no, that was pretty much all of it. I don't think it makes Christianity any more plausible, just because Christianity has a lot of supernatural claims that I think are. I mean, the reality is that if there's a God that actually wants to have a relationship with us, the very fact that there are apologists and people trying to make arguments like this shows that the religion is just false. Because just logically, if I wanted to have a relationship with someone, I'd go and knock on their door and shake their hand. And if a God actually wants to have a relationship with people, then he made the universe, right? In the story, he can come and knock on my door. It's not that hard.
Well, I think that's. I mean, I think that's a nice recap of some different perspectives. So here is a comment that I got that I wanted to highlight, and I actually have about 20 different comments that I wanted to go into, but we don't have time to go into all of them. And I definitely, Max, we're going to get back to you and look at your comments. And Darren, like again, we always have an incomplete conversation, but I did want to talk about this because I've gotten at least 3 emails since I put out the most recent CTF video saying some version of the fact that I was doing this for funding. So yeah, so I do want to. So this was a comment that I got. I have a family member who says you're just being funded. Somebody give you a grant. Can you prove that this isn't true? Are you sponsored somehow? Yeah. So let me address that really quickly because I got there's somebody who's been commenting on my channel who's been commenting since I started it. Who sent me like a really long email, like probably the equivalent of 5 or 6 pages, basically saying that I'm a grifter. Now, I do want to push back on this a little bit, and I want to do it with some stuff that's I hope is factual enough. Number one, just so you know, I don't know if there's any way to verify this, but my channel is not monetized. So I get personal satisfaction that more people are engaging with the video. I really appreciate that. But on the other hand, like I don't get any money from advertisements. There's YouTube. It doesn't just generate pennies, which is all I would get for a video that got 4,000 views. It generates nothing, like $0. So I don't get any kind of monetization from my channel. I just want to be clear about that. There's no grant funding. If people
Yeah,
want to,
can I just like chime in here to say
oh sure,
that
sure.
there's like a marker for things that are grant funded, and you have none of them.
Okay, that's a
Which
bit.
is, I'm not saying that like negatively, and I'm not. But like if you're being funded by a grant, you have to like mention that you're being funded by a grant in academics. That's like necessary to even append to your argument.
Well, that's true. That's true. Having said that, I mean, I would love for someone to do similar analysis to this that would be grant funded. It's never going to happen. Like this is too theistic for anyone to fund it with a grant.
I don't know. Templeton might fund things like this, but you're in the world where if you're getting a grant, you're the kind of person who's going to put it out there. So
I have actually gotten grants.
This is a non-starter, so I just don't see that this person is aware of how grants work.
Well, that's true too. But the bigger thing that I wanted to say is that, and I have received grants before. I think where grants would really help with the CTF argument is, it would really benefit from a statistician looking at some of the quantitative claims that I'm making and revising them. I've actually hired 3 different historical grad students or people with graduate degrees in history to look at the CTF argument. So I hired them on Fiverr. So that'll be a video that I put out. But that's just being paid for by my own money. That's not anything that, and it's just Fiverr, but so it's not that much money. But it's not, I mean, it's not really that trivial either. But the point that I'm making is this. I don't have a Patreon. I don't have a ministry. If people want to donate money to me in any way, they can't. I have some books that have been released, but they've sold, like a few copies each. I'm not like a super successful author, and I don't
stillborn from the press.
What's
like
that?
David Hume described his first book as falling stillborn from the press.
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually quite content with that. Like, so if you've watched my video, like I almost never will do anything that plugs any of my books or any merch or any product. I've never like plugged anything. There's no sponsorship. I guess I just want to make the point that like somebody sent me like literally a 5-page angry email. And this is the first reaction that I've had to this video, but this is the first time that I've received this claim from more than one person saying that I'm some sort of grifter or that I'm somehow profit driven. I just want to assure you, this is not a good grift, right? There's no way to get me money. There's no ministry. I don't plug a Patreon. And the other thing I want to say is there's a lot of really great atheistic channels. I don't begrudge them at all, but they often say like, hey, you can sponsor me. You can go to my Patreon. And nobody goes to them and says, well, this is a grift. So I would argue that the case is more convincing that I'm not a grifter. I understand when people come from a theistic lens that there might be that inclination to come to that conclusion. But I guess I just want to underscore that, none of this is profit driven. I just feel the need to say that.
Shout out to Tacos in the chat.
Oh yeah, Tacos in the chat too. All right, quick Christian Guitar 206, tough crowd. I think you should get some points considering a lot of your methodologies, how historical claims are judged in general. I did try to incorporate academic methodology. I didn't go into that much in the video. Taco is in the chat. Tavo, the issue is you have to write with character. That's yeah.
My guess is that's a joke.
Okay. All right, yeah. Grifting is presenting a position, profiting from it that you don't believe that you're in, doing it just for the monies. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And by the way, I've posted Mega Bloodbaths. It's not a Patreon, but it's like a Ko-fi, K-O-F-I. If you look at my posts on this channel, you'll see, so if you hold your position, ask for money to support your beliefs, it's not grifting. No, I actually agree with that too, but just to err on the side of caution, and because I actually do make a living I'm quite content with, I'm probably never going to monetize. I'm assuredly never going to monetize my channel. I'm never going to have a Patreon. Just to err on the side of caution. But I agree with you, Taco. It's not grifting if you're just saying, this is what I believe. You should enable super chats. I probably will not do that, but we're small enough that I'm able to go through all the chats, but that might be an interesting idea. If I ever did that, I would give all the money to charity. I would not keep any of the money. Oh, that's kind of you to say. Okay. And I appreciate the kind comments, Taco. I'm sure Taco's got, and Taco, you have, if you want, you can put in the chat that you have a bunch of debates coming up this week on your channel. You're welcome to I'm kind of curious to know what your schedule is.
Tomorrow is a debate on evolution between Dr. Greg and a guy named Darth Arenas. And then I think this weekend, I'm not sure if it's Friday or Saturday, there's going to be a debate between Monkey Boy and Eli Nix.
Okay, well, yeah, those are great. Those are great people. Yeah. Okay, just chilling before passing out. I haven't slept yet. Well, it's nice to see you in the chat, Taco. Certainly great. And we've been on for about an hour, but yeah. Oh, yeah. And unfortunately, Taco was demonetized as a YouTube video, which is very unfortunate. So that's not something I'm in favor of. Now let's get to some of Max's objections, because I promised Max some time, and I appreciate, Max, that you've waited so patiently, and I really appreciate your comments. So why don't I go back to this overview slide, and we can talk about whichever argument you want to talk about, and then we can skip ahead to that relevant slide.
Okay, so I just recently looked into the intellectual legacy point. And frankly, I think it demolishes the entire what you have there. So to explain it, one of your sources is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And the guy who compiled it is I don't know if I can pronounce his last name properly, but it's like Eric
Schwitzgebel. Yeah, Eric Schwitzgebel.
Schwitzgebel.
Yeah.
So I found his blog, and what he has to say about his own list is that it's a list of mainstream Anglophone philosophy. And he links to a paper he co-authored called The Insularity of Anglophone Philosophy. Do you want a link to this?
I've found it. I've seen his. Well, keep going.
So
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
The basic idea is that all your sources are Anglophone, and they cite each other. So it appears as though, nobody is citing Confucius, but it ignores China. I mean, you're ignoring most of the world with your lists. They're all Anglophone. This doesn't seem to prove anything about their intellectual legacy on a global scale.
Yeah, and I would argue that there is a bias in the CTF argument, and that I probably need to expand to other resources. Now, I would argue that the Anglophone bias isn't as much a bias towards Christianity for several reasons, and I've talked about this in the comment section. Reason number one is the secular Occidental literature, the Occidental academic literature in general, is highly secularized. So I would expect that no theological figures would be mentioned at all, right? The second reason, none of this doesn't. Now, let me clarify that the takeaway that I get from your comment here, and is the takeaway that I had at the beginning of putting up this video, which is that I have to expand my literature search. There's not a great way to do that outside of the English literature. I tried looking at JSTOR. It becomes exceedingly difficult to go through JSTOR citations in a way that is meaningful. So if you have a different database that you think I should query, let me know, and I will query that database.
So
if you just think you got to expand it, I'll take that as a statement that I would agree with.
No, there is a problem because there's secular Russian language, secular Arabic language, and secular Chinese language scholarship that these databases simply don't have in them.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't disagree with that. I think it should be expanded. I mean, to me, there's enough evidence that it points in a certain direction so far. But there's other reasons why I would argue that. Number one, we do see that Buddha does get cited a lot. There's a lot of citations of Buddhism, but they appear more concentrated in literature that involves meditation studies. So that suggests that Buddha is being cited, but he's not being cited in a way that's direct and not in a way that's constructive. In other words, people are saying this is a nice thing about Buddhism. This is how you can use meditation practices, and these are some of the benefits of those practices. That's different than a constructive direct citation. The other point that I would push back on is many of these. So the other point that I would push back on generally is these writers are all writing in a. Now again, expansion is a good idea, but these writers are all creating literature in a way that is informed by multiple different traditions. So it's not that they're not aware of these other traditions. The other point that I would push back on finally is just that we don't see any similar veneration for Paul. So the fact that the teachings of Jesus are really built on constructively and directly and engaged with directly and constructively is interesting in the absence of, the fact that Paul isn't cited at all. We don't see other Christian sources being cited. And definitely none of these people are citing any of these sources apologetically or confessionally. These are all people who are constructively and directly citing. It doesn't totally make the argument go away. And I think it needs to be expanded. But I would argue
it begs the question. It's begging the question because the arrow of publication is that Paul is first and the Gospels are later. And there's very strong arguments that the Gospel of Mark is simply a text that explains Pauline theology to initiate Christians. And if that's the case, then the arrow is exactly the other direction. It's just not understood to be the other direction by confessional Christians who accept the standard mainstream narrative. Like, and I think that's a live option since David Friedrich Strauss first wrote back in 1830.
Well, that's a minority academic scholarship position. But I would also argue
it's a minority in the English language and German language literature. It's not necessarily a minority in the entire secular literature. If you take the literature of all secular scholars in both Russian language and Chinese language publications.
But are you just saying it's not necessarily a minority opinion if you take those perspectives, or you're saying for a fact it's not the minority perspective?
Again, you have all kinds of
so you're making
biases in the English language and German language literature.
You're making an assertion. You're saying that if we looked at the Russian literature, it would no longer be the minority.
No, I don't.
You don't know that.
I haven't done a publication count. I don't know the specifics.
Okay.
But I do know that there was a
Well,
strong,
we know that there's at least one body of literature where
20th century body of literature in Russian that did not privilege any of these narratives.
But we know that there's at least one body of literature that we have studied where this is a minority opinion.
Sure. Yeah. But
that's all I'm saying.
It happens to be the one that like you and I both inhabit.
If you want to say that this is a more popular conjecture in the Russian literature or in Arabic literature and Indonesian literature, I just want to underscore that's a conjecture. It's not based on any evidence.
It's not a conjecture even in the English language and German language scholarship that the Gospel of Mark is a Pauline theological text that is like it is anti-Petrine and it is arguing for Pauline theology over the Jerusalem Council theology. That's like fairly well established.
I would disagree with that. I don't think that's a majority scholarly opinion.
Unless if you are counting like scholarly opinion based on non-confessional and non-creedal signature scholars, I would say that is a majority opinion. If you include confessional theologies where they have to sign, Paul is anti-Petrine. Like that's the entire issue of the 2nd century, right? But
that's a very different conjecture than that.
It's
Mark
not a conjecture. You can just read Mark. It's very anti-Petrine.
Well, that's a very different conjecture than that Paul was the source that Mark is drawing from in all the literature that Mark is writing about Jesus.
I mean, I can demonstrate it for you, but it's a separate issue. All I'm saying is, to some degree, the argument as you have it constructed begs the question because it assumes things that I don't think are in evidence.
Well, I mean, but again, it's only begging the question if I believe that your conjecture in assertion is an accurate depiction of the evidence, right?
No. You have to start with equipoise, right? You start with equipoise.
I'm starting with the majority
look at both sets of arguments. Well, but again, starting with the majority of scholarship, when the majority of scholarship is confessionally biased, may not be accurate, right? If we were in Soviet Russia and we were analyzing the life sciences, we would see a huge bias in favor of Lysenkoism, but we would not be accurately assessing the reason for that.
And I don't want to get us drawn down another rabbit hole, but I like, is your contention that the majority scholarly opinion is that Jesus was a failed apocalyptical prophet? Like that seems to me
absolutely.
Okay, all right. That's not a confessional conclusion, is it?
Belief. I think it's influenced by confession. Yeah. I mean, Bruno Bauer was a sideline because somebody wrote a really great article that like showed how Bauer's arguments didn't work.
Wait a
was sidelined because of confessional uncomfortability with his position, with his thesis.
What year was that?
Again, I accept the scholarly consensus that the historical Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. I don't disagree with that. I just think that
it just seems like
it's far less. There's far less you can construct from that than I think you're doing.
Would you argue that Jesus being a failed apocalyptical prophet is an argument against apologetics? Like that's not an apologetical argument, correct? So it contradicts.
No,
that. I mean, here's the overarching point about the intellectual legacy argument, though. Whether or not you believe that, like, let's say you're a mythicist and you believe that there was never any historical Jesus and that Jesus was just a Pauline invention, okay? You would still, be able to cite an intellectual legacy spawning from Jesus, right? You would just say,
absolutely right. The literary history Sure, and again, exactly the same way. Like that's the point I bring up in my first like response is Moses and Yoda both have like a substantially like positive historical reception on the part of many people, even though everybody sort of agrees Yoda didn't exist, and a sizable number of people know that Moses didn't exist. So,
Are you saying it's the scholarly consensus that Moses didn't exist?
yeah, absolutely.
Well, isn't that profoundly anti-confessional? That's not apologetic. That's not confessional. That's people saying there was no historical Moses, right?
Yeah, but I mean,
So what
if
happened to
you
the
took
confessional bias?
well, okay. So if you surveyed biblical scholars across the board, you'd probably get 65-35. But if you are only taking people who don't sign a confessional doctrine of inerrancy, then it's going to be, probably 80-85 to 15.
Yeah, I actually don't know what institutions require doctrines of inerrancy to be.
Loads of them, loads.
Yeah. And let me be clear.
And I was trained in many of them.
let me be clear. I've spoken against that. Like I've said, you should not, if you're a scholar, it's antithetical. It's like if you say, all right, you can go into physics, but only if you sign a statement that says, I agree with like string theory. It's just not something that is right to do in any circumstance. But let me ask you a question. What was you're a medical doctor, correct?
Yeah, correct. I attended almost entirely institutions that had confessions of faith my whole
And even as a student, you had to
career.
Even as a student, you had to sign attestation?
Probably, but I don't remember. I'm sure that if I had been like doing counter apologetics back then, I probably would have gotten kicked out. Yeah. Although there was like a very open like counter apologetic kid who did not get kicked out. He was very Fabian in his tactics.
Let me bring it back to a conclusion here, though. Max's point on intellectual legacy, which is that this is not a complete analysis, even though I've studied 3 different data sets, is well taken. I should expand my search beyond the English literature. I definitely will. There will probably be subsequent iterations of CTF. So I take that as a very, very constructive and very salient point of criticism, Max, and it's a very well made point. That doesn't necessarily mean that I think the evidence as it is doesn't at least point in a certain direction.
I don't think it does point in a certain direction because the Anglophone countries are unduly influenced by Christianity.
Absolutely.
Well,
have you Tavo, have you read Burton Max, who wrote the New Testament, or
I started it because that was what you suggested. Yeah.
So he's very clear that like whatever is being written down in the name of Jesus does not have any like clear tie to the actual like speeches of the prophet.
Well, but that's sort of a different question, right?
Well, but
that's a different question because like no, I'm saying, this argument only depends on a literary Jesus having these lessons.
Okay, well then that's not made clear.
What you're arguing is just slightly nuanced from what Max is arguing. Max is saying that the intellectual tradition, because these are Anglophone sources, is unduly influenced by the Christian milieu. What you're saying is different, that you can't tell that these arguments came from the historical Jesus. Now,
if it doesn't come from a historical Jesus, it's no longer theological, right? It's literate.
Well, I mean, let me put it to you this way. I don't know that changes the perspective of the rational theistic gambler. It certainly didn't change my perspective, right? In other words, when I started reading the New Testament, I felt like these are great teachings. I was actually, when I first started reading the New Testament, I was actually a mythicist. So I was actually, I had absorbed some lectures from Richard Carrier, who's, I now necessarily wouldn't agree with. And I definitely, given all the behaviors that he's had that have been really inappropriate and very, very unfortunate, I don't suggest people go look up Richard Carrier. But having said that, I was interested in the intellectual legacy of Jesus, while I thought that Jesus was a mythical character only and wasn't historical. So anyways, I think the argument still has some merit, that there's a set of teachings here that are intellectually rich in terms of the fact that they're good fodder for other people to build their arguments on top of. Anyways.
Sure, but let's bracket Carrier and bracket mythicism, because I don't think they matter to the argument. If regardless of the historical facts, all we have are the texts, and we can't reliably say the texts go back to a historical figure, which I don't think you can do, then what is the theological claim being made here? That's like, this is the other problem that I had like going through it, is like, what is the claim? Are you saying there was a resurrection, or are you saying that the idea of a resurrection is satisfying and has caused people to have better lives and have better health and feel better about themselves? Like, I don't know what the soteriology is here.
Yeah, these arguments are all generally things that zoom out and therefore zoom a little bit away from the resurrection. Now, I have my past video that I hope you've seen is my video with there's a little shout out in the chat, so I'll comment on that. Daniel Clark, I haven't seen you before, but feel free to ask any questions. And by the way, we're getting close to the 2-hour mark, so I'll probably try to wrap things up shortly. But I do want to get to more of Max's questions specifically, so we'll get to another Max question.
If I could just say one more thing about the intellectual legacy.
Sure.
If you're going to do future videos on it, I would have a huge disclaimer, like if you've got Anglophone data sets, it should be clear that most of the world's philosophy is not being represented. And if you expand it over time, you can say exactly which ones are included and just clarify the limitations of that better than I think it is in the current videos.
That's a fair criticism. Yeah, you're saying acknowledge the limitations. I mean, that's a fair criticism. I do want to say this, that the original video that I made for this was quite a bit longer, and I think there were more acknowledgments of the limitations. There's several problems with acknowledging limitations in a YouTube video. Number one is just length issues. Like, we try to keep things very brief. Number two, whenever I acknowledge a limitation, people do seem to use that as let me put it to you this way. I've written about 50 peer-reviewed publications in my own field, okay? In every one of those publications, I do a pretty good job of acknowledging each and every limitation. I don't do that as much for YouTube videos. And the reason why is because whenever I argue for epistemic humility or calibrated uncertainty or acknowledgement of limitations, it always ends up that those are things that are used against me in the comment section. So in other words, if I said, hey, this is very limited, you know, is blah, 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 then that would be the everyone would be like, aha, look, you admit you're and I'm like, that's an appropriate academic practice. But for purposes of brevity and for purposes of just a public facing argument, I may or may not do that. But I think it's a valid criticism if I don't. If this were a paper, that would definitely be a criticism that I would acknowledge. And if you and Max, I would encourage you, look up find a database, find a way to study it, and shoot me an email and say, check out this database. I'm open to learning. So yeah. Okay, next criticism, Max. Great point.
Okay,
great point.
So I think the big thing hanging over a couple of these points is colonial empires of Christian nations have had an influence on the entire world. In some sense, it's not that surprising. Jesus is venerated pretty much everywhere. All these countries, pretty much all of them, were under Christian occupation. So in some ways, it's an expected finding, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, that's another issue. I don't know that collapses all of the arguments in CTF, but it might collapse some of them.
I think it applies most to the first one and possibly to intellectual legacy as well, to an extent. Maybe not as much the ones that are based on earlier testimony. That's before the colonial empires. But I think it does. I think it's a significant one for cross-traditional veneration.
Well, I mean, but the problem with that as a standard is you have to show that the colonialism unduly influenced Christian spread to other religions in a way that was potentiated, that showed an impact. In other words, almost all of these religions, with the exception of Jainism, have had some imperial spread at some point in time that gave them a lot of geographic and regional advantages that we don't necessarily see them playing out in CTF criteria.
Sikhism and Baha'i have not had imperial spread.
That's true. Yeah.
I
mean, both those, Sikhism originated in 1499, but Baha'i originated, I think, in the 17th century, right, or 18th. So those are all much more recent religions. But I mean, those have been majority religions of at least certain areas and societies. I think Jainism is the only religion that's never been a majority and has never been imposed on anyone. But
which is not a good look for humanity, because it is one of the most coherent religions.
So we could talk more about Jainism. I think it's a beautiful religion. I think it's well, let's go to Max's. Let's keep the focus on Max.
So cross-traditional veneration overly focuses on specific individuals, which I think undercuts the influence of religions like Hinduism, which don't really have a central figure, but they have had influence. Concepts like karma and dharma and samsara have influenced other religions. Sikhism, I believe, Buddhism, I'm pretty sure, Jainism, they have been influenced by Hinduism, but it's not veneration for a specific guy.
Yeah, but as I said in the CTF argument, I think if you had a single doctrine that was adopted by multiple different religions, that would also be a source where the rational theistic gambler would start with a higher epistemic confidence. So I think it's reasonable to say that the cross-traditional veneration should apply to a doctrine just as well as an individual.
Right.
Now I want to give a little bit of pushback because I have a video coming out about this, but one of the original things that I put in the CTF argument, which I ended up deleting from this video, and I've deleted it from a few different videos, is the fragility index for each religion, because we do tend to see religions like Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism through an Occidental lens, and that Occidental lens is opacified by the degree of philosophical laundering, which is a very well acknowledged thing that happens in a lot of different traditions. Just to give you some examples, like Confucianism started off in a very, very theistic theological way, and gradually over time, because of essentially fragility, those religions changed quite a bit. Now, I actually think that's a point against some of those arguments. In other words, if I encounter an argument and it changes over time, and there's capitulation based on surrounding influences like secularism, then to me that makes me less confident that the core theological message is likely to be true. So I'm kind of starting the rational theistic gambler perspective from what these religions originally proposed. Now, if you rank all these religions by a fragility index, in other words, what percentage of their original founding doctrine are abandoned in modern times, I think you wind up with a very different list of rankings. I think that's an interesting discussion point in and of itself. I don't know that that disproves your point necessarily, but I think it certainly makes the point that, Now, the other thing that I would say is we do have authoritative figures in Hinduism. I would argue that Swami Vivekananda, being a very respected, authoritative religious source for Hinduism, was somebody who was speaking for a large part of the Hindu community. Maybe it wasn't as hierarchical as the papacy, but it was definitely like a voice of authority who was speaking from within Hinduism from a very authoritative perspective.
So, okay, so that's fair enough. There are authoritative figures, but I still say the argument as I saw it in the video, doesn't take into account doctrines I'm just saying that as it's currently written, it doesn't seem to take into account Hinduism's influence on other religions.
That's a valid point. Yeah. I think looking at doctrine might be a fun thing to do. My next video that I'm working on now, it may not be the very next video, but it's probably going to be 2 or 3 videos in the future, is looking at a fragility index score for each religion. I think it's interesting. It doesn't necessarily make it more or less true, but it is interesting that Christianity seems rather distinctively anti-fragile. It's not the most anti-fragile religion. Probably
so
Islam.
I don't know if I'd agree with that. I mean, just look at all the different denominations. If it was anti-fragile, wouldn't they all just hold together with the original beliefs?
Yeah, and I don't want to argue this point too much because
Sure.
I don't have the evidence in front of me.
Okay, all right. I'll wait for the next video.
Here's what I did. I looked at 15 doctrines for each religion, and these are all religions that formed before 1500. People usually date 1500 as the advent of modernism. And then I looked at whether or not those religions are still have those doctrine. In other words, how many of those 15 founding doctrine are still around after modernism? The religion that scores the best is Islam. Interestingly, the religion that scores probably, I'm still playing with the data, probably second or third or pretty close to it would be Christianity. Maybe second might be Sikhism, but Sikhism is in 1499, so it's right on the cusp of the modern period. It's a fascinating point that you're making. Would the rational theistic gambler create a syncretic perspective by looking at different religious doctrine and seeing areas of consensus. I think that's an argument that could be made. I'll tell you, my own perspective is quite syncretic. I've read the Kitab Yaqdas of Baha'i faith. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful book. I've read the Guru Granth Sahib of Sikhism. Wonderful book. I always recommend people read it. I've obviously read the Quran several times. And yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. It's an interesting argument. It's an interesting way that CTF could be expanded. Yeah.
Mhm.
Let's do a couple more, and then we're getting to 2 hours, so we'll probably wind down there.
Okay, so I guess one final thing I'll try to get in is about. Okay, so I think it applies to a few of the points, and it's about written records and how likely we would be able to find them. And I was trying to push the point that I thought literacy would be an important factor, which is not really taken into consideration for like creedal and kata. I don't think it was really. Yeah. So and for attestation lags, there's like the data founding is, I guess, kind of a proxy, sort of, but it doesn't exactly line up with literacy. So I don't think those ones take into account the specific situations that the religions arose in that could affect what kind of, attestations we have records of.
Yeah, I mean, so here's what I did for attestation lags. So I looked at how I did a best fit curve because we had like 153 data points for attestation lags.
Mhm.
I couldn't do that for codicological speeds. And the reason why is we only had 13 data points for each codex, right? Because we had one data point for each codex. And so, I mean, I could do that, but it would have really wide the region in the expected 95% curve of the what I'm saying, like the statistical region within 95%, the expected region would be huge because there's only 13 data points. So it does work well for attestation lags. Now it's sort of flawed to look at recentness or contemporaneousness. It's probably not a word, but it's sort of flawed to look at that as a surrogate for literacy. Christianity did arise in a highly literate environment, but I think you still have to answer the question of why people were writing about it. I think if you go with literacy, you can potentially collapse some of the CTF criteria. Now that does meaningfully decrease the confidence if you can do that enough. But I think enough of these criteria are distinct enough. Like, for instance, I don't know that intellectual legacy would be that affected by this. Witness density wouldn't necessarily be affected by that. Attestation lags might be. Creedal speed would probably not be. Archaeological verification probably not be. And certainly the qualitative arguments that I get to on the next slide. Attestation congruency with secular events. Now, this is one of the ones that I wanted to get through in this video, which I didn't get to, but just to make the point, I think a really interesting metric would be how early attested our theological events compared to secular events in their own region and in their own cultural context. I think the way I make this argument, I think it's really quite persuasive. But
I would love to address that on your next live, because that is like, I just view this host so differently than you.
On my next slide?
On your next live, the next time you have a live, because I know we're running out of time. But I do think like the way you're phrasing that is just, I just see it very, very differently. And I'm curious if we could find a way to see it together the same way.
Oh yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah. But here's my point is there an inordinately large lag between Christian attestations and other events in the Roman Empire during the same time period? There is not. Okay. But that is only meaningful in CTF, really, if I can do that analysis across each tradition, right? So if I look at,
I would also agree that that is not true. Like there's a huge lag compared to many important events in the Roman Empire in that time. Many. Are you really saying the time lag to the descriptions of the Second Punic War is comparable to the time lag of Christianity?
Well, I don't know the timeline between the documentation of the Punic War and I was looking at events specifically between 10 CE and 60 CE to have events around the Christian narrative.
Well, sure, okay, but
agree.
even there, the death of Augustus, or the ascension of Tiberius to the throne, or the
I know the death of Augustus.
Caligula, all those things
yeah.
are the invasion of Britain by Claudius. Those are all like directly attested by eyewitness to the events at the time they take place.
Some of them are, but not all of them. So here's the data where I actually talk about this. So, all right, so these are Christian events. These are the other events that I looked at. So the Christian events are actually attested within a roughly similar time frame to other events.
I don't have time to go through each one here, but I mean, again, this would be a topic for another time because we're running out of time. But,
Sure. Well, Max, let's do one more, and then we'll bring it to some closing statements if we want to do that. That's something I've been doing.
I don't know if I have any about the quantitative ones. I think maybe the qualitative. I have one little comment. I think one of them was about the documents are written with historical intent. Is that one of your?
Yeah.
I don't know that that's unique to Christianity, because I think the Buddhist councils were written about in a way that seems to be historical. I mean, I'm only superficially familiar with these documents, but it seems like they were written with a historical intent to record what happened at the first Buddhist council after the death of Buddha.
You mean what they were writing did it appeal to other contemporaneous documentation?
I would have to look at it more thoroughly. I mean, I guess it depends on what this point entails. Like, if it's written with named individuals that we know are historical figures, we know the author was one of Buddha's disciples, a real historical figure. Do I know that it was appealing to another historical document? I don't know if that's the case or not, but I still think to an extent this is written as a historical.
You may be right, and I haven't done a direct comparison to Buddhism, but I would argue that the appeal to the living witness tradition is less so. Certainly, there's fewer living witnesses that are named, and we have other sort of ancillary attestation in early apologetical literature that suggests that there was definitely, like, people were like, you can talk to these people who are still alive. This is a living, like, there's sort of a living memory of healing events.
Mm-hmm.
There is openness to verification and falsification. That may be something that's in Buddhism. I'll have to look at that. And again, this is something that's qualitative, but it could be moved to an empirical category if we were able to sort of operationalize criteria evenly. I don't think there's as much citation of contemporaneous documentation. I don't think that.
I mean, I'll admit I only superficially looked at it. I just thought it was something to look into, specifically the recordings about the early Buddhist councils. But maybe I'm not wrong, and it's not as.
I would argue the comparator class is another problem, right? The competitors of Christianity in the 2nd century are Platonism, Epicureanism, and Stoicism. Well, for 3 of those, we have the founders' actual writings.
Yeah, but does having a founder's actual writings make a religion more valid? Like, we have writings from L. Ron Hubbard. It's not. I don't know that.
I don't think those are like Platonism is, what is it? I don't even know if it's a religion or not, but it was certainly regarded as a religion that was competing with Christianity in the 2nd century, as were Stoicism and Epicureanism. So if you use those as comparator classes, then Christianity comes out worse. It just depends on how you pick the scorecard.
Well, I think, I mean, I'll have to, I'll have to look into whether or not I should have included Epicureanism.
I mean, Justin is literally arguing that his system is better than Platonism. So it was certainly a live option to Justin.
Yeah, but I guess my point is it still a theology?
Well, Platonism is certainly a theology. It has a belief in a God.
Well, let's turn it back over to, well, we're getting to 2 hours, and I think I wanted to stop right around that time.
Yeah.
So let's
I get
let's
that.
do some closing. Let's do some closing statements, and we just go down the row. So, Max, do you want to give? Oh, and Max, let me just say one more thing to you. You're welcome to email me. My email address is on my channel, but it's just Dr. and then my name at
Mhm.
Gmail. So, but
Okay.
I appreciate your comments. I thought they were kind of funny. You were the one who commented the last comment. I was like, thank you for the compliment. And then your response to that was, oh, this is not a, it's not. I think you're absolutely wrong. Like, don't take it too. It was humorous.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was
Uh,
you, right? Yeah.
I'm trying to remember what comments I left. I don't know. I mean, I don't remember exactly what I said anymore,
Well,
to be honest.
let's do a quick round of closing statements. So maybe take 2 minutes to plug your future appearances or your YouTube comment or content or
I
whatever.
mean, I don't have anything to plug. I gave up on being promoting myself and doing anything. I'm just a private citizen. But like, I don't know if my closing statement is to reiterate what I said about intellectual legacy. To me, it's a vastly weaker point when I understand the data set, and I still think it needs a disclaimer. But that's about. I'm just going to leave it at that because you've heard what I have to say about
Sure.
that.
Go down
Yeah,
the
I
road.
mean, I find the argument overall, it's probably one of the most interesting cumulative arguments a Christian has, or in favor of Christianity. I'm not going to say a Christian made it because you're not exactly, but I did kind of find the archaeological point fairly strong, relatively speaking.
That's helpful because we didn't go into that much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I didn't go into it because I didn't really have any complaints. Maybe other people did and they didn't get a chance, but I didn't have any. I don't think it's that convincing on its own, but I don't see anything wrong with it exactly. And I guess the stuff about the Jewish temple is also kind of interesting too. I don't know if it convinces me of anything, but it's interesting historically.
Have you seen my entire video about that?
I don't think I did. I just looked at like the main video with all the points laid out. I don't think I've looked into like specific ones yet. No.
Let me I'll put that in the comment section, so it's something that you can check out as well.
But I mean, I guess that's pretty much all my summary.
I appreciate it. I appreciate the engagement. It's been a fun conversation, and you've been very patient. I know we kind of got sidetracked. Dr. Kurt, you want to give a little closing statement?
Oh, just real quick, if anybody's interested on my Substack, which is substack.com/ekurtallen. Actually, I think you have to put the @ symbol, but you can just go to Substack and search for ekurtallen and you'll get me. ECURTALLEN, no spaces. I take on all 10 of your arguments, I think in 6 posts. So if anybody wants to see my like detailed thoughts.
Great. And do you have any appearances coming up?
I don't have any debates planned at the moment. I go on Taco's channel most of the nights he's on, but if he's too late, I don't.
All right, Darren, anything else?
Not much. I would just say that I'm still waiting for how you connect these different points to the religion being true, because as far as I can tell, none of them actually point to the religion being true. And if you've got a rational theist, then I'm not sure how any of these points moves him towards Christianity if none of the criteria you're using point to the truthfulness of the religion.
Okay, well, just for Max's benefit, I did put into the chat the most recent video, and Kurt, I will look up, it's Kurt Allen. I'm just going to say it out loud so I remember it, because I did actually try pretty hard to find your Substack. I looked for Dr. Kurt, I looked for Kurt Atheist, and I looked for Allen 0456 or something on Substack, and I couldn't find any of those. So I'll do a better job of looking for your Substack, but it's just, if I go to substack.com and I search for Kurt Allen.
Yeah, and I have 2 links that I think are links that I just tried to put in the private chat, but I don't think they're coming up.
They're not coming up in the private chat. I don't know how to fix that, to be honest. So that's maybe a topic for something I'll look into. But I will earnestly. I just want you to know, though, Dr. Kurt, I did earnestly look for your Substack. I actually tried a few ways, and I even did like an AI search, and I was like, "Is there a Substack by Dr. Kurt?"
I think it came up in the private chat in the back here.
Okay, I'm not seeing it, but
you have to click on private chat instead of comments.
Oh, let me go to the top here. So comments on stage. No. This is, I'll find it as E. Kurt Allen, right? E. Kurt Allen. Okay. All right. I will do a better job of looking for it. And if I really look forward to reading it.
Yeah, I just clicked the link in the private chat, so it's working.
Well, this was a long conversation, but we got 2 hours in, and we've had some interesting revelations. I don't do enough self-promotion, but we're almost to 700 subscribers. So if you haven't already subscribed, thanks very much. If you haven't already subscribed, I would really appreciate you doing so. I'd love that. Check out the video. It's almost to 4,000 views. So if you haven't seen the video, it's in the video description of this thing. And I'm going to be on TNC Apologetics probably on Wednesday. So I'm looking forward to that conversation as well. I've really enjoyed putting out this video. I did a lot of research on it. It was like really months of work and like hours on several nights. So I'm really grateful that all the comments have been really respectful, very flattering, way more than I was thinking. And I think they all sort of acknowledge that this was a lot of work. I'll keep going. I'll keep doing it. I have a lot of calibrated uncertainty and epistemic humility. So I hope my arguments come across in a way where it's transparent that my needle towards confidence in God and my needle towards confidence in Jesus are constantly moving back and forth and titrated a little bit depending on what intellectual content I'm engaging with. So it's been a really nourishing and enriching journey for me to be here. I hope people will check out the video in its length. I hope you'll engage in the comment section because that really has been wonderful. This comment section got very unwieldy because I've never had a video do this well, but I'm looking forward to putting out more content, and I'm really grateful to everyone who's listening and everyone in the chat and everyone else. Thank you so very much, because like I said, I was not expecting any of my videos to get to 4,000 views, much less this one. And to have that sort of synchronicity lining up of the video that I put the most work in, that I was most proud of, actually doing quite well on the channel, that's something I was also not expecting. So I live stream every Monday at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. You all are welcome to schedule time with me anytime. So if you ever wanted to do a live stream with me at a time that works better and address some of your arguments more specifically, I would really love that. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. It's been a really fun chat, and I'm going to end the stream now, but I hope that you all really please have a really wonderful day.